today's event, it's basically a walkthrough of the life of 𝐸𝐸 and 𝐸𝐸. And basically it takes you from what the Quran, what the Hadith, etc. talk about 𝐸𝐸. It talks about certain concepts within Islam in juxtaposition in comparison to Christianity. So our concept of salvation, our concept of who is Allah, etc. when it comes to Christianity and Islam. So it's a very, very informative walkthrough, and one that I think if masjids could incorporate it, it would be absolutely wonderful, inshallah. So like I mentioned, the banners take you through the life of 𝐸𝐸 with certain core concepts comparing Christianity and Islam. But we had a great session today. It was, we had a nice group of people. They asked a lot of pertinent questions, some that were a little more difficult, like questions like on abortion and other things like that, and some that were more kind of theological and more at the root of things. So I would encourage anyone that is looking to host something in their masjid to have something like this, because it's a very easy way to invite people. It's not abrasive, it's not aggressive, and I would highly encourage it.
Well, my name is Terry, and this is my husband, Mark. And we come to the mosque here often for events, and I love all the events here. This one is especially very interesting because I didn't know, what the Quran said about Jesus. So it was really interesting to know. So I found it very educational.
Thank you for having us.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Tawab. I'm one of the volunteers here at MasjidAlSalam, and I'm one of the volunteers for this event, and on the Dawah team as well. So this is a great event. We advertise to the community at large, and to our neighbors and coworkers, and as you can see, there's a lot of posters here that show about Islam.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Maryam Mubin, and I am the sisters representative at MasjidAlSalam. Today's program has been very exciting. It was a Dawah initiative, a way to walk through 𝐸𝐸's life, and we had we have posters here, some books to collect, and also a recording of the Surah Al-Maryam.
Oh, this event was alhamdulillah was successful, and we were expecting so many people, but people came in and they were asking questions. And then we have brother Fahad Tasneem. He was answering all questions according to the people was asking the question. Alhamdulillah, we should have these programs every quarterly. So this way, a lot of people can understand, and we can preach those dawah to other people there.
You guys, if you had questions, I'll just give you like a brief, backdrop to Islam. And then if you had any questions based on what you saw, questions about Islam in general. So very briefly, usually when people ask me like, what is Islam and who are the Muslims? I usually tell them the easiest way to understand it is if you understand that Islam is basically two things, to make it really easy. It is predicated upon a love of the divine and submission to the divine. And you need both. So as a concept, if you think about what is the purpose of life, that's kind of at the core of it, it's to worship God. And that worship, again, is predicated upon love and submission. So why do you need to have both? Well, number one, you need to have both because one is an incomplete type of worship, if you were talking about the divine. You could think about like a father who loves his son, but hopefully is not going to be doing everything his son wants him to do, right? Otherwise you'll have very entitled children, as I'm finding out myself anyways. So that's not worship in the sense that we talk about within Islam. Similarly, you could have just submission and no love attached to it. You could have a tyrannical king whose subjects submit to him, but there's no love. That also is not worship in terms of the purpose of our life from the vantage point of Islam. It actually needs both. So the question would be, all right, so if there is a God, is that God worthy of love and is he worthy of submission? So we would say he's worthy of love because A, each and every single one of us here has a heart that beats and doesn't ask us. We breathe air and it's not something that we can say, you know what, I think I'll take a break today. And so everything that we have, and if you start to enumerate the blessings of God, sometimes I'll ask people to think about their molar teeth. Like, no one thinks about their molar teeth until when? You go to the dentist, right? And then they're like, oh man, right? So, but it's one of the multitude of blessings that are innumerable when it comes to God. So if that's the case, if he has given all of this to us as a pure gift, is that being not worthy of love, right? Similarly, or not similarly, but and that the divine is worthy of love because not just because of the gifts he gives us, because of who he is. So when it comes to who God is, we say he is maximally perfect in his mercy. He's all powerful. He's all knowing, and so on and so forth. So just in light of that, you have a natural sort of inclination to praise, something or someone with attributes, even though they don't give you anything. So like, I don't know what sports you guys like to watch, but I'll give a basketball analogy, right? So if you find like Steph Curry and he hits a 3-point shot, right? And you just, inside of you, you're like, whoa, that was epic, right? That was amazing. So you praise Steph not because he came up to the stands and gave you $200, right? You praise him for a quality that he has in and of himself. So if that's a created being like Steph Curry, how about the one that created the entire universe and created us and our dispositions and our psychomotive states and so on and so forth? So at the core of it, God is worthy of love. And then why would God be worthy of submission? Well, because if he created everything and he loves you more than you love yourself, and he knows the entirety, so he has the entirety of knowledge. Not just knowledge in terms of the details of how this carpet is made and all of that, but even the details of morality, how human beings function, how we come together, what is true ethics and morals and things like that. And if that's the case, if our knowledge is limited, and just if you see the culture wars going on in the US today, it's kind of, we're getting to a point where, we're tearing each other apart. Well, one of the ways to kind of transcend that is to say, hold on a second. Yes, we have a certain understanding of ethics and morals and things we should do and we shouldn't do. But when it comes to the divine, he has the entirety of knowledge. So he has the picture and we only have the pixel. So that being the case, that submission is not due to him just out of love and who he is, but because of his knowledge, right? So bringing it all together, the crux of Islam is based upon loving God and submitting to God, right? And that's the first, what you can say, part of what we call the shahada, which is to testify that there's nothing worthy of worship except God. Now, the second part of the shahada, or the testimony, is that Muhammad is the messenger of God, right? So from the point of view of if God is worthy of worship, there has to be some way of knowing how to worship him. And this is where prophets and messengers come in, with books and with their own persona. And so amongst those, we say that the people who worshiped God, who knew God, who loved God, in terms of maximal perfection of a human being, those would be the prophets and messengers. That would be Adam, that would be Noah, that would be Moses, that would be Jesus, that would be John the Baptist, and that would be Muhammad, because these were people that exemplified what it means to be servants, worshipers, and righteous people that we can look at and say, this is our model. And so that's where the second part of the Shahada comes in, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of God. So that's just a really brief, I didn't want to make it too long, but that's Islam in a nutshell. So if you guys have any questions, specifically about how we view Jesus or anything else, I'm more than happy to take those, if you have any. If not, then we can start with a tour. Wait, you're not?
I'm going to ask a question anyway.
Okay. Is that part of the rules? No, I'm kidding. Go ahead.
Do Muslims worship Muhammad?
No. So that worship is purely for God and God alone, right? So, when we think about worship, worship is such a thing that, there was a scholar, a modern scholar who said that all human beings worship something, right? So there's something that you love the most, something that you submit to the most, right? Something that you want to know the most. And that could be yourself, right? You can, at certain times, in fact, the Quran mentions have you not seen the one who takes his own desires as his worship? And we're living at a time where desires have become an act of worship. We do what we want, how we want, whenever we want, right? So, but that worship, once it's now taken from things that are like dependent and given to the one that's independent, then you have kind of this purity in your worship. And so some people say that, yes, all of us worship things, but if you want true freedom, that only comes when you worship the divine. So,
Thank you.
no, good question.
On your last panel
Yeah.
here, it has I don't remember the wording, but it has a listing of things you must believe in to be with God in the afterlife.
Sure. Okay.
And it includes heaven and hell.
Yep.
And I had not heard that before. Can you tell me more about your concept of heaven and hell?
Sure. So the concept of heaven is that heaven is a place of pure bliss. So one of the realities of, at least from our perspective, of this world is that you have elements of heaven and elements of hell, right? So there'll be times when, you know, you'll feel a type of bliss, and there'll be times where you'll feel terrible, right? But pure bliss is only for paradise, and pure punishment is the hellfire. And that's basically what determines whether you enter paradise or the hellfire is really your time here on earth. And so it is ineffable in the sense that, you know, we can only have somewhat of an understanding of what paradise is like. But there are, for instance, sensual pleasures in paradise. I know this is a bit different than perhaps generally the Christian understanding of paradise, but that's fully in line with our understanding what paradise is. So the sensual pleasures you enjoy here, food, drink, marital relations. In fact, when it comes to marital relations, a very famous scholar, Imam al-Ghazali, he said that the maximum taste you can get of paradise is when you are having marital relations with your spouse, right? When you actually get to the point of that highest point of pleasure. Because that's the closest you'll get to knowing the deep pleasure of paradise, right? Paradise is a place where, you know, in this world, we have what they call decreasing utility, right? So you might like coffee and you drink your first cup and it's great. But the second cup isn't as good as the first cup. And the third cup is not as great as the second. And you have this diminishing utility, right? With anything, right? So food, drink. Paradise, on the other hand, the bliss is explained as there's an increasing utility. So every sip you take and you take one more, the one that you take after it is actually, in fact, better than the one you took before it. So it's actually opposite of how you experience bliss. And so while we can't know paradise in its actual reality, we have a taste of it, right? Similarly with the hellfire, it's an increasing amount of pain as well. And so that's kind of a brief overview of paradise, hellfire. And there are, sensual, realities that are in paradise. And like I said, I think it's a bit different within the Christian paradigm by and large, as far as I know. So, anybody else?
Is there any notion of somehow contemplating or seeing God in paradise? Like
Yes.
Paul says in Christian scripture.
Sure.
Then now we see as through a glass darkly, then we shall see face to face.
Right. So one of the, excellent question. One of the greatest pleasures in paradise is to actually see God.
Okay.
So that's not something that's related to this world. That is the highest pleasure, to be able to see God, right? And of course, that goes back to the concept of who God is. If he's the one that's loving, maximally merciful, the heart of the person would be eager to meet God, right? And so that's why it's one of the highest pleasures of paradise is when you get to see God. Yeah. So, all right.
Do you have something equivalent to a judgment day?
Oh, of course. Right. So I think that might have been on the last poster, but so yes, there is a judgment day. The judgment day, perhaps like it is in Christianity in certain respects, when you die, you're resurrected and your deeds are then weighed out, right? Now, some people may think that, okay, well, so it's based upon your deeds. And then so where does the concept of the mercy of God come in, right? And what we say is that, yes, we do good deeds, but each one of those deeds is weighed and given weight way more than the quality of the deed itself, okay? And that's why we say when we enter paradise, we enter by the mercy of God because it's by his mercy that he's given so much more weight to the deed than the actual deed itself, right? So as an example, one of a really good deed is fasting, for instance, in the Islamic paradigm. But it's not easy because you don't drink water, no liquid, no food, no marital relations from sun up to sundown. So if you can imagine, midsummer, if you want to fast, it's really, really hard. Right? It's very challenging. But the Prophet Muhammad says that, peace be upon him, he says, the one who eats and is grateful to God, like that's a state of the heart, grateful to God is like the one who fasts. Now, being grateful and eating food is a lot easier than withholding from food. So we see that the deed itself has a lot more weight in terms of its value because of the mercy of God. So when Muslims say we enter paradise by the mercy of God, it's predicated upon deeds because God is merciful to have done, given those deeds weight, the weight it has. So the concept of the Day of Judgment is that those deeds are then weighed, which is another interesting facet, is that they're weighed and they're not counted. Because one of the other aspects of deeds is that a lot of it has to do with intentionality. So if you have the appropriate intention or the right intention, then you get the credit for the deeds. So like, let's say you wanted to get up and go to the mosque for the morning prayer, but something kept you from going. You had the intention, and you know yourself what is an appropriate intention, not like, oh, I had the intention, but my alarm was lovely, right? But you made all the necessary means, but you go out and your car's not starting. All right, well, guess what? You didn't make it to the mosque, but you get the full reward for having gone to the mosque, prayed in the mosque, met your other people in the mosque, good cheer, and having come home, even though you never physically went there. So it's based upon intention, and that's why the idea is that your deeds are weighed as opposed to just being counted. So it goes back to kind of doing good deeds and moving from there. Now, my guess is there may be another question related to that, related to original sin. Is that correct?
You brought it up.
Okay. So one of the first differences that we see between Christianity and Islam, starting right from the get-go, is the concept of the Adamic fall, you can say. So from the Islamic point of view, when Adam ate from the tree, or Adam and Eve ate from the tree, this was not a sort of cosmic stain or anything like that. In the sense it's described in the Quran as a slip, right? فَزَلَّهُمَا الشَّيْطَانُ. Satan caused them to just slip. And that being the case, when they slipped, God basically approaches them, gives them words of forgiveness. In fact, the words are, he meets them with words of forgiveness. فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ, right? So he meets them. And one of the nice things about that is that if you think about Adam and Eve being the first created being, they don't have any sort of socialization. They're all alone. And they've been, according to the Islamic narrative, they've just been taught language. And so now they're in a type of vulnerable position where you find that God now comes in a way that's merciful, that's kind, that's loving, and he teaches them how to ask for forgiveness, right? And then it says that God forgave them, right? Turned to them and forgave them, and they were forgiven. So human beings at the core from our perspective, we're born on something called fitra or al-fitra, right? And that means that all human beings are born in a state of goodness, in a state of purity, in a state of debt-free, if you want to look at it from a legal standpoint. So, but that purity and goodness is every single human being. So from our vantage point, every single person here, your base state is good, right? I think that the Christian narrative is a bit different, where that forgiveness doesn't happen, and so therefore there's a stain that's kind of carried through generations or whatever it may be. But that being the case, why do our deeds become important? Because if there's an occasion that happens that's out of our control, this is how we look at it, that there's an occasion that happens, Adam sinned, we inherit that sin, and then in order to do something about that sin, there's something, again, external to us, which is Jesus coming and dying for the sins of humanity. Both things are external to us. From the Muslim standpoint, or the Islamic standpoint, is that we've been given agency, as opposed to, these aren't about events that are external to us, but these are about us and our direct relationship with the divine. And so therefore, when you do deeds, it actually helps with spiritual progression and spiritual kind of upliftment to get closer and closer to the divine. You guys probably haven't studied about lobsters, have you? Anyone? Lobsters? No? So I remember there was there's someone that mentioned something about lobsters, and I'll finish on this point because it ties in with this concept of spiritual progress. He said that if you ever look at lobsters, has anyone eaten lobsters? Yeah, a few of you, right? So they're mushy on the inside, right? And they have a hard shell on the outside. So what happens is when lobsters, when they start to grow, they feel uncomfortable because the shell doesn't grow. So they have to go behind a rock. They have to shed the shell, and that rock will give it protection while it grows a new shell, right? Now the thing is, you can compare that to things that happen in your life, right? The vicissitudes of life. And so when you go through ups and downs in your life, that spiritual connection, in order to have spiritual growth, you have to have some sort of discomfort. You have to have some sort of, you're not completely comfortable in your shell, right? If you gave that lobster Percocet or some other antidepressant and it just didn't feel pain, it would be a negative thing because it wouldn't be able to grow a new shell. So similarly, we go through vicissitudes in life, our deeds are weighed because there's a spiritual progress that can be made and we can grow spiritually. That's the value of having this agency when it comes to our relationship with the divine. So, all right. I think I've gone on a bit too long. All right.
Why do we have so much animosity between different faiths?
Why is there so much animosity between different faiths? Because we're all human beings. We have all psycho-spiritual emotive states. And, that's part of the human project. Like I mentioned, if we didn't have those vicissitudes in life, whether it's getting a flat tire or it's not being able to agree with your neighbor or having differences in religion, spiritual growth doesn't happen. So for instance, if everyone was getting along perfectly and there's perfect harmony, how do you then show things like generosity? How do you show humility? How do you show those concepts then become almost meaningless, right? So yes, there is a lot of bad things that happen, including religions and people of religion not getting along. But that in and of itself has a purpose. And so we say that, God is Al-Hakim, he's maximally perfect in his wisdom, and perhaps the wisdom behind that is to allow us to get closer and closer to God. Because this isn't the final abode. So, yeah.
I just wish we could have discomfort without real horror.
Yeah, and that's part of the
you grow
Sure.
and stuff, but it's just hard with all this hate.
Of course.
And it wasn't that. It's too much suffering.
It is way too much suffering, absolutely. But again, at the same time, that suffering is not just meaningless. That's what we would say as Muslims. Like, we may not understand the wisdom, but if we understand that God is wise, then we understand that there is a purpose to that. And the question then really becomes, okay, there's this suffering that's going on out there, but then me, again, that agency, what am I doing about it, right? So it really does then put the onus upon the individual to, kind of find spiritual, emotional, religious means by which to now navigate the space, as visceral as it may feel. So
this kind of meetings will help a lot.
I hope so.
Higher scale.
I hope so.
Larger scale.
I hope so.
To try to understand between different people.
That is the intention, I hope, with everyone here. So we're trying. But we appreciate all of you coming out. I know it's a Saturday. You guys could have been in a bunch of different places, doing a whole bunch of different things, but you chose to come out here. So thank you so much for coming. Appreciate your presence.
Another question.
Another question.
Yes.
All right.
So what does Islam thinks about women in general?
Okay.
As far as their rights.
Okay.
And also with that, the second part of it also, why do women cover themselves also?
Okay. So what does Islam think about women? Okay. So the concept of let's start before we get to women. What does Islam think about human beings? Right? What does the divine say about the human being at the onset? So the Quran mentions وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We have honored the children of Adam, right? In other words, human beings are honored right from the get-go. There's no distinction made. Okay, so it's not the verse says we have honored the men and the women are there too. It literally says human beings, right? The children of Adam, male or female, there's no distinction that's made. So that honor is there. Now, where people may, let's say, feel that, okay, maybe there's, that there may be some sort of difference or distinction between men and women, that distinction is based upon the nature of women and the nature of men, right? And so remember, we start off by saying that God has the picture and we only have the pixel. So certain things that God knows about how women are and about how men are, right? And therefore, there are certain guidelines that are for men and certain guidelines that are for women, and certain responsibilities are for men, certain responsibilities for women, certain rights for men, and certain rights for women. So when it comes to rights and responsibilities, those have been delineated. Now, they're not going to be the exact same rights or responsibilities because we're talking about two different types of, people, two people with two different types of dispositions, right? And that's why we say that we're not in the position of saying that there's equality being identical, but we do say there's equality in value. So human beings, whether you're male or female, are all valued the same, but that doesn't mean they're identical. They're two different things. And hence, whatever rulings that a woman might have, they may seem like, hey, it might be a bit different, but they're different. I was talking to someone and, and we were talking about how the man's responsibility in a relationship, in a marriage, is that he has to provide 100% financially, right? And some men were like, wow, that's really hard, man. Like, I have to pay for everything and anything she earns is hers? He said, yeah. He goes, well, that's not fair. We should have a men's rights movement that starts. Anyway. But that's basically what it is when it comes to women and valuation rights. They're going to be different. And sometimes the difference may seem like, okay, well, that may be unfair because it's not the same. So we don't believe in identicality of roles. We believe in equality of value. And these are two different things. And that's because, does God not know what he created? أَلَا يَعْلَمُ مَنْ خَلَقَ. Does he not know what he did? He knows us better than we know ourselves. So, did that answer your?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Covering part of it. Why women cover.
Oh, why women cover. So again, it goes back to, it's women primarily cover because this is what has been ordered by God, to make it really simple, right? Now I could get into some perhaps, benefits of that, right? But those would just be my own assumptions, right? To say, okay, they cover because of modesty or this or that, and, so they don't get hassled at work, whatever it might be. That'll all be coming from my brain though, right? So the real reason why a woman would cover is because this is something that God has ordered, right? And again, if we go back to God is the one that truly loves you. He knows you better than you know yourself. There is a reason for that. Again, we could assume what those reasons are. And perhaps, some people would justify that, but that's not the sole reason why a woman would cover, just like that's not the sole reason Muslims in general would do anything, like not eat pork. So if you ask me about that, I would tell you, well, it's the same thing. God has ordered us not to eat pork. We could get into the science and perhaps, and have a nice long discussion about, well, pork is really bad for you. And someone say, look, man, my granddaddy had been eating pork since he was like 3 and he's going up to 99 and he's healthy as a ox, right? And so we'd get in these discussions back and forth. At the core of it is that love and that submission, where it takes us right back to the definition of Islam itself. So.
Well, I'll ask a related question about covering.
Okay.
I have been at this mosque probably 20 times.
Wow.
Different events.
Okay.
Iftars, programs. I have never been asked to cover before.
Okay. All right.
And I wonder what has caused this change.
So I'm not sure. I would not be the person to be able to tell you why not. So, but again, the appropriate thing to do is generally, I don't know if it's an absolute must if you're not Muslim that you have to cover, but I think just in terms of respect of the space itself, that you were asked to cover. So, yeah. So, but I don't know the logistics of the administration, what sort of, what they did before. I can speak about what's happening now, and that would be just out of respect for the place and the sanctity of the place. So,
and I think it's a fair area.
Yeah.
This area, which I think
Yeah.
has a little more, but I think if you're outside in the other multi-purpose areas,
Yeah, it may not be as strict in other areas of the mosque. So,
In a Christian church.
Yeah.
the people used to cover. I mean, the women used to cover, especially the
Right.
Greek Orthodox Church, or
Sure.
Armenian Orthodox, Russian.
Yeah, even out. I think even outside.
Now they do it less. But
Right.
About 100 years ago, or
Sure.
not only 100 years ago, but 50 years ago, they will cover more than now.
Sure.
Today.
No, I think that's a phenomenon we see not just in places of worship, but I think just generally. You mentioned 50 to 100 years ago, how women dressed just here in the U.S. Like you couldn't say, for instance, on television, you couldn't say the word pregnant.
Yeah.
It was considered uncouth, and you'd have to say she's expecting or carrying or something like that, because it was right. So now it's just. But again, remember, it goes back to like those kind of shifting sands. And then how do you deal with that when, people will have different views of ethics and morals? A peace that a person can get, or tranquility that a person can get, is to say, look, those ethics and morals, if we put our trust and reliance upon God, then whatever people are doing, wherever they may be, I can trust that it comes from a source of knowledge and a source of love, right? And so whatever people may be doing, whether they're covering, not covering, whatever they're doing, whatever fashions and this and ethics and morals, through all of that turbulence, you have this kind of stability, which comes from that spiritual connection with the divine. So,
Is that the same thing also for men also too, that men cover modestly as well to pray when the prayer?
Yeah, of course, you can't walk in like,
in shorts and things like that. Right?
Yeah, it's you'd have to be covered. I mean, it's not as strict for men, granted, but there is a de minimis there when you have to cover certain parts. Yeah.
During the early period before Islam,
Yeah.
the people of this regarding cover.
So one of the things about Islam is that it gives a high valuation to culture. So there's a de minimis, right? So like, for instance, if a woman, it's required for a woman to cover, and that's going to have, like, let's say, from here to here, head covered, and then below her ankles, whatever it might be. But in terms of what she wears, that's going to differ from place to place, right? So in Arabia, it may be a certain dress.
Yeah.
In Africa, it may be more ornate, more colorful. As long as the de minimis is met, culture is not impeded. As long as it doesn't, go against the de minimis, right? What needs to be met. In fact, one of the interesting aspects of Islam is that culture has legal precedence, right? So they said al-urf muhakkam or al-ada muhakkama means that culture has legal precedence. So your ruling on whether something is allowed or not allowed is going to be based not just on what does the Quran say, what does the Hadith say. It's going to be based on what culture are you in, right? So I think there was some years ago, or I think I gave this as a hypothetical, that if someone was like a judge was adjudicating a divorce case, and let's say he was in Saudi Arabia, and so now he's trying to decide who gets what assets. So by and large over there, they would say, okay, well, the man would get the cars and the guns and the swords and whatever else, right? And the women will get the kitchen stuff, all right? If you had that same judge to come here in Texas, it would be inappropriate for him to make that distinction, right? Because if you simply said, well, he's the man, he gets the guns, there's a lot of women that like to go out to the shooting range, right? My wife works at �W𝐚𝐬𝐿, and she tells me a lot of her coworkers, they go out shooting on the weekends. So that would be an inappropriate judgment, and that's predicated upon the culture that you're in. So culture has legal precedence from that perspective, right? So.
I have a question.
Sure.
What about the law of the land? Is that?
Well, yeah. So that goes back to what I was mentioning about culture as well.
Exactly right.
So it's predicated upon you follow the law of the land, right? It may not be a Muslim, country or society or whatever it is, but you're required to follow the law of the land to the maximum that you can, right? Obviously, certain things you'll try to push for, let's say, legislation in as much as you can do. So, if you're, if you know that there's alcohol being sold around a high school, as a Muslim, you say, okay, well, that's really bad. We want to push for legislation so that, you don't have people selling alcohol to young students. And so we want to push, let's join hands with other people that share our thoughts and try to change this, right? Or something else in that domain. So, yeah. All right. Okay, yes.
I recently found out that Muslims believe in the second coming of
Yes.
Jesus.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I'm reading here, it says that Muhammad said that Jesus will descend from heaven.
Yep.
amongst you and will judge mankind justly. So
Yes.
you believe that Jesus will judge.
Yes.
He will be the
Yes.
the judge.
Absolutely.
Don't you think that that makes Jesus a better prophet or more important than Muhammad?
Sure. So here's the thing. When Jesus judges, he will judge by the law that was sent with the Prophet Muhammad, meaning he's not coming with a new law. And so he's going to be saying, all right, well, these are the things that, that Muhammad, peace be upon him, said. And so we'll be adjudicating by way of what the Prophet Muhammad said. So that's pretty much it. So in terms of him being higher or lower, we actually don't make a distinction between prophets anyway, right? But simply he's coming back to establish what the Prophet Muhammad, had legislated, And there are a few exceptions, but those exceptions were told to us by the Prophet Muhammad, so they fall into the legislation that the Prophet Muhammad gave us. So, yeah.
So as the people who saw the flood, was called Sahabi.
Yes.
What those people will be called who will see Jesus?
What will they be called? People that see Jesus. I've never gotten that question
what
before.
What will their rank in terms of following him? Definitely, he will follow the same teaching what Rasulullah
Right.
doing.
Peace be upon him, yeah.
So the Sahabi then was those people who got the time of Rasulullah.
Mm-hmm.
And now the people, maybe in a future generation, will get the time to see Jesus and meet Jesus.
Sure.
What those people will be called and what will be their level of Iman at that time?
Oh boy, okay. So level of Iman, we would assume that it would be relatively high. So Iman is basically to put it very...
Do you mind repeating the question?
Oh, sorry. So he said, what are the followers of Jesus going to be called when Jesus returns? And then he said, what will be their level of Iman? So Iman basically is a quick translation would be faith, even though faith doesn't really cover what Iman is. But so, and faith has levels, right? How, certain times you can have a stronger faith and you may have weaker faith and something that goes up and down. So what he was asking is, what would be the level of faith of those people that see Jesus, meet him, and so on? So we would assume that their level of faith would be much higher, obviously. Someone that meets a prophet, sees a prophet, interacts with a prophet, they would potentially have higher faith. As far as what they would be called, I actually do not know. I don't know if they would be called Hawariyun or if they would be called Ashab Isa. That's out of the purview of my knowledge. So I don't know the answer to that. So,
as Prophet Muhammad
Sallallahu
best is my time.
Sure.
And the people who see me are the
Sure.
best people. Then after, as the time goes on, the level of Iman and the level of the people, faith,
Sure. Sure.
diminish.
Right.
Same thing would happen when the Jesus comes.
So again, based on the hadith that you mentioned, right? So the hadith, for those of you, the Prophet Muhammad said that the best generation is my generation. Then the one after that, then the one after that. Meaning, generally when we think about morals, we generally think that there's a possibility of moral progress, right? And so, the morals of yesterday, are not going to be as good as the morals of today. That's generally how many people think of it. But this actually goes completely against that. We said that, in fact, when you look at kind of humanity, it's not really that there's been a moral progress. In many ways, there's been a moral regress, right? And so that hadith kind of highlights that. You have the best generation is my generation, then the one after that, then the one after that. Now, that being the case, this will also be punctuated with people that will revive Islam, right? In the sense that it'll come back. You'll have people every 100 years, as you're familiar with, right? And so, they will come and revive the people to kind of get them motivated again and get them back on track. So there's kind of a decrease and kind of a punctuation. So your question about Jesus, like what will their faith be like? It may be kind of at the tail end of this, and maybe it'll skyrocket up. Allahu A'lam. So God knows best. Any other questions? So I think there's a political question. Oh, well, time's up.
Subject of abortion today.
Sure. Of today, what about today?
What's the view about abortion?
Oh, abortion. Oh, okay. I thought you were going to ask me something a lot more difficult. So the view on abortion, I can tell you the Islamic view, but I think it may be also pertinent to kind of tell you where that view comes from, right? So the view is that by and large, as a general principle, you're not allowed to abort a baby, as a general principle. Now, there are exceptions, right? For instance, if the mother's life is at stake and you have to choose between the mother's life and the child, the mother's life takes precedence in all cases, right? And again, that goes back to Islamic law and things like that. There may be certain other health-related issues, other issues of like rape and things like that, where there can be an exception. But by and large, the rule is that you don't abort a child because it's equivalent to killing a child, right? Now, there is some discussion about, the time frame in which that can happen. So the issue that arises, let's say, today, is that how do you define life? I mean, this is really where the sticking point is, right? Because no one's going to be like, well, yes, all of us, we condone murder or something. No one's going to say that, right? Even the most hardened, person that says, I'm 100% in favor of abortion, but if you ask them about murder, they're like, well, no, we're not going to say that. So really the sticking point is, when does life begin? Now, the thing is that this question, it is not a scientific question. It's a metaphysical question, right? Because there's no sort of test you can do. The most you can do is the heart rate starts or certain physical feat. But where does life really begin? And because that's a metaphysical question, our source text tells us that, well, in the first, let's say 30 days, right after that, or let's say 30, that's when the soul is put in the child. Before that time frame, it is not considered life. It still doesn't mean you can abort it, but at least now when we're talking about the exceptions, there's that area, and you understand that there's a difference between life and death based on this time frame, because that's where the angel comes and puts the soul into the body, right? So
30 days, you said?
No, not 30 days. So it's 30 days. Well, there's a difference of opinion on that too, but let's just say 90 days, right? To keep it simple. That being the case, the real kind of question here now between, okay, are we pro-life or are we pro-choice? Because I think that's really what we're trying to see, right? Are Muslims pro-choice or pro-life? But the question has a certain presupposition. We're assuming certain things, right? So the folks that say, okay, we will be pro-choice, the assumption is, well, I own myself. It's my body, my choice, right? But from the Islamic, like the theological stance of that is that no, Muslims don't say we own ourselves. God owns us, right? And so therefore, if God owns us, it's not up to us to say it's my body, my choice. Okay, so that's really kind of the philosophical, you can say, presupposition is this concept of ownership. And once we remove that, we can say, okay, well, hold on. The reason why Muslims take this position is because we believe that God is the one that owns us. He's the one that created us. And as the owner, if you own something, you can do whatever you want with it, right? But of course, it wouldn't come from a position of malice or anything like that. Going back to my first point about the maximal perfection of God's love. So I don't know if that was, yeah.
So I'm a physician, to just add to something that you said. And when I was training in New York, I had to do 6 months of OBGYN.
Mm.
I chose not to pursue that as a career. I'm a cancer doctor, but in that training, there were times when, as a resident, we were supposed to learn childbirth and safe abortion. So for me, that became a bit of a
challenge.
Like, I don't have a choice not to do that because that's part of the training. So
Right.
I did what I do in my, tough times. I called a friend, which was my dad, and I asked him, like, what should I do? And of course, he didn't have an answer right away. So he said, let me ask, somebody that I trust, or I can go from my source. So in the end, the answer my dad gave me was that as a physician, you take responsibility of saving someone's life. So if it is in that capacity, learning a skill that is going to help someone save a life is like the law of the land, or is the oath we take as a physician. So, but how does one morally feel about it, or personally feel about it, or politically feels about it? It adds like further layers around it. It's like
Sure.
the atom of a problem and the orbits around it. But I have noticed one thing: all of those patients that went through that were hurt, deeply hurt by that process. Not one of them came out of it uncharred or, without any trauma. So it's a very traumatic experience for people who unfortunately have to go through it for whatever, again, personal reason that they go. So
Sure.
I just want to give you as a Muslim physician, when we
right.
go through these trainings and there are times, but then we stand in front of a patient at the capacity, which is also ordained to us from Islam, is in that capacity. We don't heal. I tell my patients, I go to the same place for miracles where you know, God.
Right.
So, but for me, the degree is MD, not GOD. Right. So technically what we do is we just, what we don't know, we seek counsel, we seek help, but it's difficult. Yes. But thank you for asking that question. It's an important question.
Yes, go for it.
I was just thinking that when we said that God owns,
Sure.
whatever. So in the case of what we're talking about, abortion.
Yeah.
So it's still a woman's body.
Sure.
And you say God owns it.
Sure.
So I think that's still between her and God, and not the government.
Oh no. So I wasn't. So
you know what I'm
right.
What I'm saying, not you personally.
Right.
You know, when certain religions and governments get into it.
Sure.
But what you said that made sense was, well, yeah, God owns you.
Yeah.
So that choice, maybe the government or religion or somebody might not like it, but that's like between her and her God. It's not between me, God, and the government, and
Sure.
you know, the Vatican or any other.
So so where the Islamic position would be is that the government has its own challenges, right? Because again, depending on who's making the rules, that it's gonna it'll shift, right? And so remember what I was talking about. We try our best to influence the government in a way that we think will bring human prosperity. So this may be part of that, right? So in terms of the government deciding what you do and what you don't do, this goes back to kind of a political, philosophical backdrop, right? Like how much should the government be involved, as opposed to the specific issue of abortion, right? So my kind of underpinning the issue of abortion to say, okay, well, here we're talking about ownership. There's a philosophical predisposition or a philosophical presupposition, right? And it goes back to ownership. So, if we truly believe that God owns us and we're Muslim, then that is what God tells us what we're going to do, right? And by extension, we feel that would be good for humanity as well, right? Now, it's not for us to tell people what to do living in the United States, and where you fall in terms of how much the government should be involved. I think that that as a political issue, it shows us the limits of human beings, right? And I'm saying that from the position of the time and age that we're living in right now, where you have such a dividing issue like abortion, right, amongst other issues as well. It kind of testifies to, look, human beings are going to be limited in the domain of morality and ethics. And as time goes on, as we find like more and more people becoming more and more kind of going from on one side or the other, right? And then people are very passionate about, which they should be. I mean, it's not something that's light, but that sort of passion on either side, that can be adjudicated if you had kind of guidance from God, is essentially what I was trying to say. Yeah. So
sir, these rules were not dictated in the Torah and Bible regarding the abortion, like what Quran very clearly specifies. Was that being in those books too, the guidance?
So that might be a question for Steve. In terms of clear delineation of rules of abortion, I don't know if that's...
Well, there are principles again.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know much about this.
Right.
There's a statement where God says, I knit you in your mother's womb. Right?
Gotcha. Right, right.
And there's, it comes up in the Quran several times, right, where God creates human beings from a seed.
Right, from an alaq, right, which is yeah.
So,
yeah.
But that doesn't say when it begins.
Right. Okay, thank you for that. Yeah. So anyway, I think we want to start the tour and just kind of give you a tour of the mosque, and otherwise we could be here all day. I appreciate everyone coming. Thank you so much.